My name is Abaseh Mirvali, and I'm a curator, a former museum director, and I work with cultural communities. My background is a bit unique because I did not start fully in the arts. I actually studied philosophy, politics, and literature. And I've worked the first 8 years of my professional life. I worked in politics. I worked on a presidential campaign in the United States and then went abroad to work in Central Asia and Turkey. But I hung my first shows with artists from Uzbekistan in 1996. And so I started making catalogs and small exhibitions when I was there, and then eventually in 2004 I arrived in Mexico City, and my job was a senior advisor to the United States Ambassador for Culture and Education, and I curated my first exhibition at the American residence in Mexico City, and a few years later I left to be the director of the Jumex collection and foundation in Mexico, and since then I've been in contemporary art full time. But in the beginning of my career, it was more passion, and I had a day job. You know, in some ways, I started my career very differently than the traditional. Traditionally, many people are either curators, or they're assistant curators, or they're researchers at a museum or an independent space, and then they work up. And I kind of started the other way around. I started running an institution. And then I decided to, after running that institution, I went to the United States and I did a biennial called the Biennial of the Americas, and I was the executive director and the chief curator. And after that is when I made a decision to work independently as a curator, because I felt that when you are a director of an institution, even if it's a small institution, in Jumex's case it's a medium-sized, it would be considered a medium-sized institution, about 65% of your work is management, administration, and the well-being of the organization. Whereas, and in the United States, that percentage decreases in management, but the space is taken up by fundraising. As institutions need a lot of funding, then you're put in a position of fundraising. So with the biennial, I was fundraising, I would say a good 50% of my time was fully fundraising. And I felt that I was not able to do a lot of the curatorial work. As a result, I wanted to be independent. I felt that as an independent curator, I would be able to have the freedom to do the shows with the artists that I wanted to work with. And curatorially, I work with a very limited number of artists. My vision as a curator is represented by about 20 to 22 artists, and some designers and some architects. And I work within those mediums interchangeably. As a director, or when I lead a project, of course it's much more expansive, and it's more inclusive. But I aspire to, I hope during my career, to be able to do a specific project with each of those 25 artists, architects. And so working independently, you have the freedom to work with the people that you wish to, but you're constrained in other ways, such as economics, or having the best space, which of course when you run an institution, you have those privileges, but you might be obligated to curate shows of artists that you might not feel as passionate about as other artists. So there's a give and take in each. I would say they each have benefits. I would think that I will probably be returning to an institution soon. I think that my ambitions have probably changed. You know, I think when you start, you then immediately want to work towards being in an institution such as the MoMA or the Tate. But I think I'm now more attracted actually to more medium-sized institutions. You know, I went to Toronto last year, and the power plant, it's a beautiful space, and it's you know, it's the size that one wants, and the budget is in that $4 million, $4.5 million to $6 million range, which if you have some public funding then makes it easier. But I think it's depending on your ambition of what it is that you want. I would say I'm more attracted to the medium-sized museums now. And I'm also, after having done the biennial in Denver, Colorado, I'm attracted to second cities. I think there's so much, there's such innovative thinking and activity going on in other cities that are not the first cities. And we don't pay as much attention to those communities. And I think that would be interesting. You won't get any disagreement with me. I do think that there's a tremendous danger with the commercial bodies kind of dominating the scene. Now, I think within that statistic, we need to also consider it. Some of those galleries do have a roster which is pretty extensive and has clearly amazing artists. But again, I would agree with you, having tried the last few years that I've been independent to put more a diverse grouping of artists, particularly as I live in Mexico and I've worked in Latin America, or I lived in Turkey and I've worked in the Near East. I do find it very challenging to put shows in people's museums, but not because they don't want it, more because they can't fit me into their structure if they have an existing team. So I think that's one of the benefits of being independent, that you can advocate for a different kind of a show. But I'll tell you, it's a lot of work, and it's not always successful, but certainly I haven't stopped trying, and kind of, I took a Toronto-based Iranian artist and curated that show with Jose Roca in Bogota at Flora. But it took Jose being open to that and for us to jointly fundraise. But then the project is amazing and has now opened a door. But until you do the first one, you're right, it is, there's a danger of that other kind of programming dominating the scene. When I was at Jumex, I was very apprehensive of the fair and the commercial model. But again, I think you have choices. And I think, for instance, Arteba is run by a foundation, a 100% non-for-profit foundation. So all the monies are inverted into cultural programming. And I felt comfortable doing my first project. They were my first project that was outside of, and it was basically working for a non-for-profit. The galleries derived the benefits, but the monies were then put into me being able to take Marcelo Cidade and Roberto Ventur and Daniel Stigman and all these wonderful artists for a 1-month residency basically in Argentina. So I always make sure that the project goes beyond just me curating 12 booths at the fair. It involved a whole residency program. And I've been very, very cognizant of making sure that all the projects that I've done that are maybe related to a commercial entity, for them to have other byproducts, whether it was talks or whether it was a residency component and whatnot. What I found that was a learning lesson with the gallery, the project I did in Istanbul, that you actually have a lot of curatorial control. You work the closest I've ever worked with an artist. It made me reevaluate. If I wasn't so uncomfortable with the actual commercial selling, I would have a gallery. I would have opened a gallery a long time ago, because you really get to work one-on-one on all aspects of the show, and I kind of like that. You're not just working as a curator, you're working as a museographer, you're working as a technical person, you're the research assistant, you're the writer. You pretty much do all of it, particularly if it's a young gallery. So I actually have to say that I loved it. It's just that from my personality, I'm a very good fundraiser, but I'm not so comfortable selling. So, which is why I never went to the commercial side fully. I mean, I think there's several challenges. As you correctly point out, I do believe that there is a lot of wealth, but it's concentrated in certain areas, and those areas don't seem to be in the public sphere or with many of the independent spaces, certainly not with curators. Curators and writers are paid, I would say, very poorly, something that I think needs to change, but can only change if we as a profession organize ourselves a little more and speak up for each other. You know, when I ran an institution, when I ran Jumex, for that time, I paid curators extremely well. Because I knew that their salaries at their institutions were so low that if I was asking them to, on top of their daily work, do another project for another institution, you had to compensate them to make it feasible for them. And then also paid writers very well. This is not commonly done. Writers are actually even worse than curators. I feel the worst for them. They're in the worst situation. I believe that institutions, you know, my big obsession and my big challenge, what I would like to work on during my career, is rethinking the institutional model. Rethinking it to be able to be more supportive of different ways of thinking. You know, when I did the biennial, I hired 2 young women who were pregnant. And I remember the board was very upset because they were like, how are they going to do the work? They're going to go to part-time. But I feel that we have to make models, because people don't stop being intelligent because they're on maternity leave, or if but you need to make a model that is accommodating to them working, for instance, from home. And so for me, I've been like looking at institutions and how we can rethink those models so that they are supportive of the different personalities, different economic levels, different sexes, but also what they provide for their community. You know, so for instance, I find that a lot of museums directors have to make have to make a choice. Either they want to be on the top 100 power list and they want to be included in the events in Basel. So they curate a lot of shows of the artists at their institutions, or they want to serve their community, which might be at a level where they're just starting to understand contemporary art. So you have to do a mixture of local content with some international programming. And so I think that if we made structures that are a little more supportive of each other, shared in costs, traveled more things, worked more collaboratively, I think we can actually find ways of being economically a little more generous in the other areas. I also think this movement towards having individual museums is a very dangerous one. I personally understand when there are people that have a collection and a mission which they want to personalize by having a building and having content. But I think that, again, maybe there is a way to have those discussions, such as for example, what the SF MoMA did with the Fisher collection, where the Fisher collection was promised and a new addition was built onto the museum, instead of having them going and building their own museum elsewhere. That would just divide resources. So I think that we just need to think a little more holistically and think about the community as a whole. So, but I have to say that I'm really proud of kind of the next generation, the young men and women who are in their mid and upper 20s, particularly the women. I find that they have a much more entrepreneurial spirit than certainly I did. I thought always very institutionally that I have to work for an institution to have my voice heard as a curator, as a museum director, as someone who wanted. And the young people, they are finding platforms. You know, the woman that started Artbinder, you know, they're thinking in these innovative ways of how to work within the system, but they started because there were no jobs. They didn't do that originally, so they had to be creative, and I think that's been a plus. That's the only plus that I can think of the lack of jobs or the very low-paying jobs, that it's pushed a whole new generation to think much more in an entrepreneurial way than we did in our generation, certainly. I spend most of my time looking at new artists. I spend a lot of my time doing, like, teaching. Like when I went to Jose Roca and Flora, I did 20 portfolio reviews over the 8-9 days that I was down in Bogota. So actually majority of my work is looking at artists and working with younger artists. And I incorporate them into projects I do. I incorporate their practice in dialogue. But when I do the long term, for example, I did a double museum show of Simon Starling in Casa Estudio Barragán and El Eco in Mexico City. Simon Starling has not been shown in Latin America other than at the Sao Paulo Biennale. There's one piece at Inhotim, and there were several pieces owned by Tamayo Museum in Mexico and one collector in Mexico. So doing those two shows took 3 years. From like beginning to end, it actually was closer to 4, because he was not an artist that was as known in the cone, and I did projects that were very site specific so that he could dialogue with the cultures, with the community, and with other artists. But majority of my day-to-day work is actually looking at new artists and finding how they're able to play with the new languages. And for example, and the second grouping of projects that I do that are sometimes related to some of the fairs. For instance, I launched the international section at in Arteba called U-Turn. When I created that project for them, I made a premise that the best cities for production of new work were Sao Paulo, Rio, Mexico City, Bogota, and Buenos Aires, and Lima, o sea, Lima, Peru, and Berlin. So I brought 6 young galleries, everybody in the same age range. This is before Mendes Wood was Mendes Wood. So it was Mendes Wood and Jose Garcia and Raber von Stenglen. Now it's, 7, 8, 9 years later, and they're now in Art Basel. But back then they were like in Liste. And we brought artists that were our generation, young artists, Alicia Quades, Sadana Fif, Michael Dean. These artists were not Daniel Stigman. I did that in 2011. And to bring them to Argentina, they physically came. They spent a month doing the projects. And we launched this section that is now really successful. And my successor is Jacobo Visconti Crivelli, and he's continuing, so he curates it. So I actually spend most of my time reading, researching, and looking. But when I do these long-term kind of museum projects, they tend to be with those 22 to 25 artists. But when I was doing the biennial, there was a mix. I get quite a few of them, yes. It's very hard for me to say no. If someone takes the time to write to me and ask for my help, I often get messages on Facebook, and people have heard my talks a lot. And I think that at Basel and at Basel Miami and other places, and for better or for worse, I think I speak from the heart because I wasn't, I didn't go to Bard, so my language is a little more accessible. I read the same Foucault and the same Arendt and all that, but I think I speak in a different way. So people have often communicated with me, so I look at their portfolios. And I do travel a fair bit, which is challenging, again, because of the economics, but I try very hard to make sure that I have an ability to get to. So I'm not just at Art Basel. I actually take the time to see people and then also go to the other fairs listed and look at artists.